The cold seeped through Leo's thin jacket, a damp, insidious chill that felt like it was crawling straight into his bones. The sound of the eviction officer's voice still echoed in his ears, a flat, impersonal drone that had sealed their fate. The property must be vacated. Just like that. Their world, cramped and imperfect as it was, had been reduced to a few worn bags on a wet sidewalk. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, but the image was burned into his memory. The landlord's pitiless stare, the click of the new lock, the sight of Mia's favorite stuffed bear lying discarded in the gutter, its button eyes staring up at the grey, unforgiving sky. He felt the rough texture of the brick wall against his back, the only solid thing in a life that had turned to liquid chaos. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. He was 35 years old, a mechanic, a man who fixed things. And he couldn't fix this. He couldn't fix anything. He had failed, utterly. He opened his eyes and looked at the meager pile of their belongings, a pathetic monument to his failure. The city air was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp decay, a scent he now associated with absolute rock bottom. His gaze drifted to the curb where his rust-pocked sedan sat, silent and defeated. The engine had given out 2 days ago with a sickening clatter of metal on metal. A death rattle he knew all too well. It was a terminal diagnosis. The cost of repair was a galaxy away from the crumpled bills in his pocket. Now, the car was just a useless shell, a constant, mocking reminder of his inability to provide even the most basic shelter. Inside, curled up on the torn passenger seat, was Mia, his Mia, a tiny, fragile form wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Every few moments, a dry, hacking cough racked her small body. The sound was like a nail being hammered into Leo's chest. It was a small sound, almost lost in the city's din, but to him it was a siren wailing a dire warning. The wind picked up, rattling a loose piece of chrome on the car and carrying the icy promise of the coming winter. He could feel the cold not just on his skin, but deep within his soul, a premonition of the sickness that was stalking his daughter. He felt a tremor of pure terror run down his spine. Hunger was a constant, gnawing ache in the pit of his stomach. For 3 days, their meals had come from a can. Cold beans yesterday, canned spaghetti the day before. Tonight, it would be the last can of cold corn, its metallic sweetness already a phantom taste on his tongue. He remembered the faint pop of the can opening, the smell of preservatives that clung to the air in the cramped car, a smell that had once meant a quick meal and now signified desperation. He could almost feel the slick, cold kernels in his mouth. He watched Mia as she slept, her breathing shallow between the bouts of coughing. Her cheeks, usually rosy, were pale and hollow. He could see the faint blue veins beneath the translucent skin of her eyelids. A profound, crushing guilt washed over him. She deserved warm meals, a soft bed, the simple security of a home. Instead, he was feeding her from a tin can like a stray animal. Her only bed, a ripped car seat that smelled of mildew and old oil. His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. The helplessness was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Reaching into his pocket, his fingers trembling slightly, Leo pulled out his entire net worth. He unfolded the worn bills and smoothed out the coins on his knee, the cold metal a stark contrast to his clammy skin. He counted it again, for the 10th time. A 20, 2 10s, a 5, 2 singles, a handful of change. He arranged the coins meticulously. 25, 50, 75, $1. He pushed them aside. 25, 50, 75, $2. Another pile, 3 quarters, a dime. He lined them up. $47.85. That was it. The sum total of his life. Not enough for a motel room. Not enough to fix the car. Barely enough for a few more days of canned food and maybe some cough medicine if he could find a cheap enough brand. The number echoed in his mind, a final, brutal judgment. $47.85. A wave of dizziness washed over him. Mia coughed again, a weak, rattling sound that seemed to steal the very air from his lungs. The fear for her, sharp and acidic, was a poison in his veins. She was getting sicker. He could feel it. He could hear it in the wetness of her cough, see it in the listlessness of her sleep. As the bruised purple of twilight bled into the sky, the streetlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters on the pavement. The city's indifference was a palpable force. People walked by, their faces illuminated for a moment and then swallowed by the darkness, their hurried steps a rhythm of lives that were not his, of worlds that had not crumbled. For them, he and his daughter were invisible, just another piece of unfortunate scenery to be ignored. Leo felt his shoulders slump under an invisible, crushing weight. It was the weight of his wife's memory, a ghost who would be so ashamed of him now. It was the weight of his daughter's fragile life resting entirely in his trembling hands. It was the weight of utter, absolute solitude. A single hot tear escaped and traced a cold path down his rough cheek, leaving a trail of salt and shame. The hope he'd been clinging to, a tiny, flickering ember, was finally extinguished by the cold, damp air of the approaching night. He was alone. They were alone. And as darkness consumed the city, Leo felt a despair so profound, so complete, it felt like drowning. 4 days after being cast out, huddled in the corner of a noisy, foul-smelling city shelter that felt more like a cage than a refuge, a sliver of the unexpected cut through the grey monotony, a volunteer, her face a mask of practiced pity, handed Leo a crisp, white envelope. It was jarringly clean against his grimy fingers. His name and the shelter's address were typed with formal precision. It was from a law office in a county he'd never heard of. He felt a tremor of apprehension. Official letters had only ever brought bad news. With Mia asleep on a thin mat beside him, her cough a soft, rhythmic punctuation in the din, he carefully tore it open. The sound of the paper ripping was unnaturally loud in his head, a stark, clean sound in a world of muffled misery. He pulled out a single, heavy sheet of paper, the formal letterhead, seeming to belong to another universe entirely. His heart began a low, nervous thrum against his ribs, a drumbeat of dread and a faint, foolish flicker of something else he dared not name. The words swam before his eyes, dense blocks of legal jargon that were almost impossible to decipher in the dim shelter light. He had to read it 3 times, his finger tracing the lines, before the meaning sank in. Bequest, last will and testament, great-uncle Arthur Vance. A man he'd never met, a phantom branch on his withered family tree, had died, and he, Leo, was the sole heir. His inheritance, a small plot of land and the commercial vehicle situated thereupon, a 1978 Kenworth semi-truck. He felt a dizzying surge, a confusing mix of shock and a wild, desperate hope that was almost painful. A truck, land, his own. It sounded too much like a miracle, a cruel joke. He looked at the exact value listed for the plot, worthless for development due to zoning restrictions. But the truck, a vehicle that size, even old, had to be worth something. More than that, it was a structure. It was a roof, a potential home, far away from the dangers and degradation of the city, a place where Mia could breathe clean air. The hope, once a flicker, ignited into a small, warm flame in his chest. The decision was a frantic, terrifying calculation made in the dead of night, fueled by desperation and the sound of Mia's worsening cough. The shelter was no place for her. He'd seen the sickness that spread through its crowded rooms like wildfire. The bus tickets to the remote county of Havenwood would consume nearly every cent of his remaining $47.85. It was an insane gamble, a leap into the complete unknown based on the ghost of a dead relative and the promise of a rusty vehicle. He felt the cold sweat of fear on his neck, the primal terror of making the wrong choice. But then he looked at Mia's pale, sleeping face, the dark circles under her eyes, and the choice became clear. Anything was better than this. Anything was better than waiting for her to get sicker in a concrete room filled with strangers. Despair. The next morning, he spent his last dollars on 2 one-way tickets, the flimsy paper feeling both as heavy as lead and as light as a prayer in his hand. He was betting their entire future on a 40-year-old truck he'd never seen. The journey was a long, rumbling descent into a different kind of emptiness. The bus engine droned on for hours, a monotonous hum that vibrated through the worn seats and into Leo's bones. He stared out the grimy window as the dense cityscape bled into sprawling suburbs, then into flat, uninteresting farmland that stretched to the horizon. The air inside the bus was thick with the smell of stale air conditioning, cheap perfume, and the faint, sad scent of other people's weary travels. Leo held Mia tight against his chest, her small body finally relaxed in sleep. He whispered into her hair, a stream of quiet promises. "It's a big truck, sweetie, like a castle on wheels, our own place. No one can ever kick us out again." He said the words over and over, trying to convince himself as much as her. He could almost feel the solid steel of their new home, a fortress against the world that had cast them out. The hope was a fragile shield against the gnawing anxiety in his gut. They had to change buses at a dreary, forgotten terminal in a town that seemed to have given up. The air hung heavy with the smell of grease and disinfectant. Mia was awake now, her face flushed with fever, her body listless in his arms. Leo felt her forehead. It was hot and dry to the touch. A sharp spike of panic, cold and acidic, shot through him. He bought a bottle of water and a stale packet of crackers, the last of his change rattling in his pocket. He had to force the anxiety down, burying it under the single, desperate thought of the truck. Their sanctuary. The final leg of the journey was even more isolating. The bus was nearly empty, and the landscape outside grew wilder, more desolate. The roads narrowed, the farms gave way to dense, tangled woods and vast, empty fields. Leo felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling of being swallowed by the sheer scale of the wilderness. This wasn't just rural, this was profoundly, deeply remote. The bus slowed with a long, mournful hiss of its air brakes, pulling over to the side of a lonely two-lane highway. "This is it," the driver called back, his voice indifferent. "Havenwood County Line." Leo gathered their bags and a sleepy Mia, stepping down onto a gravel shoulder. The bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking into the distance, leaving them enveloped in a sudden, shocking silence. There was no station, no town, not even a single building in sight. They were utterly alone. The wind swept across the open road, a cold, mournful whistle that carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It cut through his thin jacket, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. Leo looked at the crude, hand-drawn map from the lawyer. The property was supposed to be a mile down a dirt track just off the highway. A deep, cold dread began to seep into his veins, chilling the fragile hope he had nurtured for the entire trip. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, and absolute. The walk was grueling. The dirt track was more of a suggestion than a road, a rutted path of mud and loose stones. After a few hundred yards, Mia's legs gave out, and Leo had to carry her, her feverish weight a growing burden in his aching arms. With every step, the strap of their bag dug deeper into his shoulder. The weight of his daughter, the weight of their pathetic belongings, the weight of his monumental gamble, it all pressed down on him. Then, through a break in the skeletal trees, he saw it. The property. His heart didn't just sink, it plummeted into a cold, dark abyss. It was exactly as the lawyer's letter had described it in its clinical dismissal, a worthless plot of land, a desolate, wind-swept patch of brown dirt and tangled, dead weeds, marked at the corners by rotting posts that leaned like tired old men. There was no sign of life, no water, no power, just a barren square of forgotten earth. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a fresh start. It was the end of the line. The wind was a physical presence, a relentless bully that pushed against them and whipped stinging dirt into their eyes. Leo turned his body to shield Mia from the assault. He tasted grit on his teeth. The smell of dust was overpowering, dry and ancient. He scanned the property again, his mind refusing to accept the reality before him. He had pictured a small field, maybe with some trees, a place they could make their own. This was a scar on the landscape. The hope that had been his fuel for the past 24 hours evaporated completely, leaving behind a hollow, nauseating emptiness. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, a harsh, broken sound that was immediately snatched away by the wind. He had traded a city shelter for an open-air prison. His gaze, desperate and defeated, finally landed on the one remaining object, the centerpiece of this cruel joke, the semi-truck. It sat silently in the middle of the plot, a hulking monument to his own stupidity. From a distance, it had been an abstract concept, a symbol of shelter. Up close, The Kenworth was a horror. It was a carcass, a massive, rusting shell that had been left to die decades ago. The tires, he could now see, weren't just flat. They were completely disintegrated, the black rubber cracked and peeling away from the rusted rims in long, brittle strips. The truck was sinking into the soft earth, as if the land itself were slowly consuming it. The paint, which might have once been a proud, deep red, was now a leprous patchwork of faded color, brown rust and primer gray. It looked diseased. The silence surrounding it was profound, broken only by the relentless moaning of the wind as it found its way through the truck's 1,000 broken places. Leo felt a cold dread crawl up his spine. This wasn't a home. It was a tomb, and he had led his daughter right to it, spending their last dollar to get here. He took a few hesitant steps closer, the feeling of being an idiot growing with every footfall. The sheer scale of the decay was breathtaking. Both windows of the cab had been smashed out long ago. Someone had tried to cover the gaping holes with thick plastic sheeting and duct tape, but the plastic had since yellowed and become brittle with sun exposure. It was torn in several places, and the loose pieces flapped and rustled in the wind with a dry, skeletal sound. Through one of the larger rips, he could see the dark, menacing shape of the interior. The once proud chrome grille was pitted and scarred, the vertical bars bent and broken, giving the front of the truck the look of a grinning, metallic skull. He could feel the cold radiating off the massive metal frame, a deep, permanent chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. It was the cold of absolute abandonment, a cold that seemed to emanate from the very soul of the machine. A wave of nausea washed over him as he circled the behemoth. The stench hit him then, a complex and sickening miasma that grew stronger the closer he got. It was a thick, cloying smell of old rust, stagnant water, and the deep, pervasive funk of mildew. Underneath that was another, sharper scent, the unmistakable odor of rodent infestation and decay. His stomach churned. The long trailer attached to the cab was in even worse shape. The metal sides were dented and bowed inward in several places, and near the back, a huge section of the aluminum skin had been torn away, leaving a jagged hole that gaped open like a wound. He peered into the darkness within, but could see nothing but oppressive black. He reached out and placed a trembling hand on the trailer's cold, rough surface. The rusted metal felt like a scab, gritty and unpleasant. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. It felt like touching death. "Daddy? Is this it?" Mia's voice was a tiny, hopeful whisper against his neck. "Is this our new house?" Her innocent question was a physical blow. It struck the air from his lungs and shattered the last of his composure. He couldn't form a word. The lie he had told her, the fantasy of a castle on wheels, was now a monstrous joke at their expense. He could only hug her tighter, burying his face in her hair to hide the sudden, burning shame that flooded his eyes. This wasn't a home. This wasn't even a shelter. It was a death trap. A tetanus-riddled, rodent-infested metal coffin parked in the middle of a wasteland. He had dragged his sick daughter across the state, spent their last dollar, all for this. The hope he had clung to so fiercely had been a mirage, and now, standing before the brutal reality, he felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. The wind howled, mocking him. He had to see. He had to know the full extent of his failure. Leaving Mia on the ground a safe distance away, he walked to the driver's side of the cab and wrapped his numb fingers around the rusted door handle. It was stiff, resisting his pull. He braced his foot against the running board and yanked with all his strength. With a horrifying groan of tortured, shrieking metal, the door swung open. The stench that billowed out was a physical force, a gag-inducing wall of rot. It was the smell of a swamp, of a tomb, of years of water and filth and decay sealed in a metal box. The interior was a scene of utter devastation. The vinyl on the bench seat was split open in a dozen places, spilling a stained, yellowed foam that looked like diseased flesh. A thick, grimy film of dirt, molds, and cobwebs coated every single surface, from the dashboard to the gearshift. His skin crawled with a sudden, visceral revulsion. The air was so thick with the smell of damp and rot that he could taste it on the back of his tongue, a foul, earthy flavor that made him want to vomit. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, He saw the source of the infestation smell. Tiny, dark rodent droppings were scattered everywhere like black sprinkles on a cake of filth. And there, in the passenger-side footwell, was the small, desiccated body of a rat, its form stiff and mummified. A cold, frantic terror seized him. This place was toxic. It was a breeding ground for disease. The thought of Mia spending even one night in here, breathing this poisonous air, sleeping among this filth, was unimaginable. He had failed. He hadn't just failed to find them a home. He had actively led them into a place more dangerous, more squalid, more hopeless than the one they had fled. The last of his strength, the last of his resolve, crumbled into dust. With a choked cry of rage and despair, Leo slammed the heavy cab door shut. The loud, metallic bang was a sound of absolute finality. It echoed across the desolate landscape and then was gone, leaving only the lonely sound of the wind. That was it. The gamble was over. They had lost, stranded miles from anywhere, with no money, no food, and no shelter, but this putrid metal box. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in streaks of orange and purple. Cruel, beautiful colors that felt like a personal insult. Leo's legs gave out. He slid down the cold, rusted side of the trailer until he was sitting in the dirt. He pulled a shivering Mia into his lap, wrapping his arms around her as if he could shield her from the disaster he had created. The crushing weight of his failure was absolute. A single, hot tear escaped his eye, then another. He wasn't just crying for their situation. He was crying because, for the first time, he truly believed they were not going to make it. The cold was no longer just a chill. It was a predator, its teeth sinking into his flesh as darkness fully consumed the desolate landscape. Mia's cough had taken on a wet, rattling quality that terrified him, each shuddering breath a countdown to a sickness he couldn't fight. A wave of vertigo washed over Leo as the sheer, brutal finality of their situation crashed down on him. They were stranded, with a sick child, and no one in the world knew where they were. The howling wind sounded like a chorus of ghosts, mocking his failure. He looked at the rusting hulk of the truck, the monument to his idiocy. He had cursed it, slammed his fist against its cold metal skin until his knuckles were raw. But now, as the temperature plummeted, a grim and horrifying realization settled in his gut like a stone. That metal coffin was their only chance. It was either face the unknown horrors inside or freeze to death outside. The choice was no choice at all. He felt his stomach clench in revulsion. He would have to crawl back into that putrid tomb and make a space for his daughter, taking a deep, steadying breath of the cold, clean air, as if it were his last. Leo steeled himself. He walked back to the cab door, his movements stiff, robotic. His hand, trembling slightly, reached for the rusted handle again. The protest of the hinges was a familiar, agonizing shriek, a sound he now associated with the deepest pit of his own personal hell. The stench rolled out to greet him, a living, breathing entity composed of mold, rust, and the ghosts of dead things. It was worse this time, more concentrated in the still, cold air. He fought the urge to gag, his throat burning. He had to do this. For Mia. He switched on his phone's flashlight, its weak, bluish beam cutting a pathetic swathe through the oppressive darkness. The light played over the scene of utter decay, the shredded seat, the filth-caked dashboard, the scatter of rodent droppings. A profound sense of self-loathing washed over him. He was a father forcing his child to sleep in a garbage heap. This wasn't survival. It felt like a desecration of his love for her. He had to make a space, a clean space. That was the only goal. His mind, numb with despair, latched onto the simple, physical task. He found an old, ripped plastic grocery bag wedged behind the passenger seat, a relic from some long-forgotten traveler. It would have to do. He started on the floor of the cab, the only flat surface. Using a piece of broken plastic he found, he began to scrape the thickest layers of grime and filth into the bag. The sound was disgusting. A wet, scraping noise that made his skin crawl. He had to avert his eyes as he scooped up the desiccated rat, its stiff little body surprisingly light. He felt a wave of nausea so powerful his vision swam. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing it down. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. He worked with a frantic, desperate energy, his movements jerky and uncoordinated in the cramped space. He wasn't cleaning. He was excavating, digging through layers of neglect and rot to find a patch of something solid and safe underneath. The flashlight beam trembled, reflecting off the damp, grimy surfaces. He focused on a small 2 by 3 foot section on the floor of the sleeper portion of the cab, behind the seats. He ripped out handfuls of the damp, stinking seat foam, the material crumbling in his fingers, releasing a fresh wave of musty odor. He used the threadbare blanket from their bag to wipe the area down, scrubbing at the vinyl flooring with a furious energy. The blanket came away black with filth. The smell of mold was so thick it felt like he was breathing in spores, a damp, earthy taste coating his tongue. After 10 minutes of grueling work, he had a patch that was, if not clean, at least cleared of the worst of the debris. It was still stained and damp, but it was a space, a small island in an ocean of filth. He laid down his own thin jacket to create another barrier between Mia and the cold, foul vinyl. His heart ached. It was a pathetic offering, a pitiful excuse for a bed, but it was all he had to give. He went back outside to get Mia, who was huddled where he'd left her, her small form shivering uncontrollably. "It's time to get inside, sweetie," he said, his voice strained, trying to sound cheerful. "I made you a spot." He carried her into the foul-smelling cab, trying to shield her face from the worst of it. He settled her onto his jacket in the small, cleared space. She coughed, a deep, chesty sound that echoed in the metal box. She looked around the dark, terrifying interior, her eyes wide in the gloom. To keep her mind occupied, he said, "Can you help Daddy? Just pat the floor here. Make sure it's all flat for sleeping." She nodded, and her small, cold hand began to pat the vinyl. Thap, 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 the soft, dull sound of her palm hitting the floor. Then a different sound. As her hand moved closer to the wall under the passenger seat, the sound changed. Thump. It was a lower, more resonant sound, a hollow sound. She stopped, her head tilted. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small. "It sounds funny." "It's just an old truck, Mia," Leo said, his voice ragged with exhaustion. He was trying to stuff the torn plastic sheeting back into the broken window frame, a futile attempt to block the freezing wind. The wind howled and tore at the plastic, a constant, mocking reminder of their exposure. All old things make funny sounds. But Mia was persistent. Thump, thump. She patted the spot again, a small, curious smile on her face. "No, listen. It's like a drum." He sighed, the sound a plume of white in the frigid air. He was about to tell her to stop, to just lie down and try to sleep, but something in her voice, a thread of genuine discovery, made him pause. He felt a flicker of irritation, quickly replaced by a weary curiosity. What could it possibly be? He crawled over from the driver's side, the cold vinyl pressing through the knees of his jeans. "Okay, let me hear." He crouched beside her in the cramped space, the air thick with the smell of their own breath and the omnipresent rot. He tapped the floor where she pointed. Thump. She was right. The sound was unmistakable. Not the solid thud of vinyl over a steel truck bed, but a hollow, booming echo that suggested an empty space beneath. His heart, which had been a slow, heavy drum of despair, gave a sudden, sharp thump of its own. He tapped the area around it. Solid, solid. Then, back to the one spot. Thump, hollow. His exhaustion was momentarily burned away by a jolt of pure adrenaline. This wasn't normal. This wasn't decay. He ran his fingers over the surface, the vinyl gritty under his touch. His fingernail caught on something, a line, a seam. He traced it with his fingertip. It was a perfectly straight line, forming a rectangle about 2 feet long and a foot wide. It wasn't a crack from age. It felt like a cut. A deliberate, precise cut, disguised by years of grime. A cold shiver, completely unrelated to the temperature, traced a path down his spine. Someone had cut this section of flooring, and then, for some reason, they had put it back. A new question, the first question not related to immediate survival, bloomed in his mind. Why? His mind raced. A secret compartment. It seemed like something out of a movie, too fantastic to be real in his gritty, desperate world. But the evidence was right there under his fingers. The hollow sound, the cut seam, He had to see what was underneath. He fumbled in the driver's side door pocket, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel of a tire iron he'd noticed earlier. It was rusted, but solid. He returned to the spot, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs. He wedged the flat end of the tire iron into the seam and pushed. At first, nothing happened. The old glue held fast. He repositioned it, getting a better angle, and put his weight into it. He felt a faint give and heard a sound like tearing fabric, the old adhesive stretching and groaning in protest. He pushed harder, with a sudden, loud "reep." A corner of the vinyl flooring pulled free from the metal beneath. The sound was electric, a promise of revelation in the suffocating silence of the cab. Mia gasped beside him. He worked the tire iron around the edges, prying and pulling. The vinyl tore away in a single, large flap, revealing what lay beneath. It wasn't the corrugated metal of the truck's floor as he expected. Instead, perfectly fitted into the space, was a smooth, flat plate of dark steel, about half an inch thick. It was welded into place, but a second, smaller rectangle was set into its center. This inner plate was what he had been tapping on, and in the middle of this plate was a small, recessed D-ring handle, designed to lie perfectly flush with the surface. His breath caught in his throat. It was a door, a hidden hatch, expertly concealed beneath the truck's flooring. This was no amateur job. It was the work of a skilled welder, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The cold dread and the wild, frantic hope were now warring inside him, creating a dizzying, nauseating cocktail of emotion. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the flashlight steady. This truck wasn't just abandoned. It was hiding something. He reached down, his fingers hooking through the cold, smooth metal of the D-ring. It felt icy to the touch, a stark contrast to his own sweaty palm. He pulled, it didn't budge. It was incredibly heavy, sealed tight by time and neglect. He grunted with effort, his muscles screaming in protest. He braced his feet against the side of the cab, got a two-handed grip on the small ring, and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. For a moment, nothing. Then, a low, deep groan of metal on metal, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the old truck. The seal broke. The hatch lifted a fraction of an inch, releasing a puff of stale, dry air. The smell was completely different from the rot in the cab. This was an ancient smell, the scent of a sealed-off space. It smelled of dust, old leather, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like old coins. He felt a surge of pure, primal excitement. He had found it. He had found the secret. He lifted the heavy plate all the way and set it aside with a loud clang. He shone his phone's light into the revealed cavity. It was a shallow compartment, no more than a foot deep, its sides formed by thick steel plates welded directly to the main chassis of the truck. It was a custom-built safe, an integral part of the vehicle, and nestled inside, occupying almost the entire space, was a single object, a dark leather satchel. It was coated in a thick layer of fine, grey dust, which swirled in the beam of his light like disturbed ghosts. The leather was old and cracked in places, the stitching frayed, but it was remarkably well preserved in the dry, sealed environment. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm. This was it, the culmination of the hollow sound, the cut vinyl, the hidden door. He reached into the compartment, his hand closing around the satchel's sturdy handle. It was heavy, shockingly heavy. The weight was dense and solid, sending a jolt of electrified curiosity through his arm. Whatever was inside was not paper. He carefully lifted the satchel out of its dusty tomb and placed it on the floor between him and Mia. She stared at it, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. For a moment, Leo just stared at it too, his mind unable to process the sheer strangeness of the situation. An hour ago, he was a failed man, contemplating freezing to death with his daughter. Now, he was kneeling in a rotting truck, a mysterious, heavy satchel at his feet. It felt like a fevered dream. He took a shaky breath, his fingers, numb with cold and trembling with adrenaline, fumbled with the two brass clasps on the front of the bag. They were stiff with age. He had to work at them, his nails scraping against the tarnished metal. Finally, one gave way with a dull click. Then the second. The sounds were unnaturally loud in the silent cab. He slowly, hesitantly, lifted the heavy leather flap, his heart pounding in his ears, every nerve in his body screaming with anticipation. The beam from his phone fell upon the contents of the satchel, and Leo's breath hitched in his throat. He felt a dizzying, electric shock, as if his eyes were touching a live wire. The light didn't just illuminate, it was captured, refracted, and thrown back at him in a shower of dazzling, multicolored sparks. Gold, so much gold. The bag was filled with it. Thick, heavy chains of yellow gold lay coiled like sleeping serpents. Brooches set with deep red rubies and glittering blue sapphires winked at him from the darkness, a tangle of delicate bracelets and rings, each one sparkling with its own inner fire. He saw the soft, milky luminescence of pearls, strung together in lustrous necklaces. It was a pirate's treasure, a king's ransom, a cascade of impossible wealth lying in a dirty leather bag at his feet. He could hear a high-pitched ringing in his ears. His mind simply refused to process what he was seeing. It was too much, too impossible. He reached out a trembling finger and touched a heavy gold necklace. It was cold, hard, and undeniably real. His eyes scanned the impossible hoard, trying to make sense of it. Tucked in a corner of the satchel was a small, heavy pouch made of dark velvet, tied shut with a leather cord. His fingers felt clumsy and thick as he worked the knot loose. He tilted the pouch, and a stream of dull, greasy-looking stones tumbled into his open palm. They didn't glitter like the jewels. They were rough, asymmetrical, and semi-translucent, like pieces of dirty quartz. But he knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, what they were. Uncut diamonds, raw and immensely valuable. The weight of them in his hand felt obscene. He let them trickle back into the pouch, the sound a soft, clattering whisper. The sheer, staggering value of what he was holding was incomprehensible. It was more money than he could ever imagine, a sum that could solve every problem he had, and 1,000 more he didn't. The hunger, the cold, the fear, it all felt 1,000,000 miles away, replaced by a profound, disorienting shock. His hands were shaking so violently now that the light from his phone danced erratically over the glittering treasure. He felt a wave of dizziness and leaned back against the wall of the cab, trying to breathe. It was too much to take in. Mia, sensing his shock, crept closer and peered into the bag, her gasp a tiny, sharp sound. "It's so shiny." "Daddy!" Her innocent words brought him back to reality with a jolt. He ran his hand through the tangle of jewelry, the feel of the cold metal and sharp-edged gems, both thrilling and terrifying. As he did, his fingers brushed against something flat and hard at the very bottom of the satchel beneath the glittering pile. He pushed the jewelry aside. There, lying flat against the leather, was a small, dark book. It was a journal, its plain, hard-bound cover worn smooth with time and handling. A thin, brittle, elastic band that had once held it shut crumbled to dust the moment his fingers brushed against it. The journal felt different from the treasure. The jewelry was a shock to the senses, a blast of impossible fortune. But the journal felt like a secret. It felt heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with its physical mass. He lifted it out. The pages were yellowed with age, the edges brittle and crumbling. He opened it carefully to a random page in the middle. In the weak, flickering light of his phone, he saw that the pages were filled with a tight, dense script, written in a faded blue ink. It wasn't a logbook of miles or deliveries. The words were too personal, too emotional. He could make out phrases, "I can't sleep," "the weight of it," "what they made me do." A sudden, piercing cold, colder than the wind outside, shot through Leo's veins. This wasn't a record of a theft. It wasn't the diary of a jewel thief. It was something else, something darker. The jewels and diamonds were the what. This journal, he realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach, was the why. Mo. He turned back to the first page, his heart now pounding with a new kind of rhythm, not of excitement, but of pure dread. The first entry was dated October 1978, the same year as the truck. The name Arthur Vance was written on the inside cover. His great-uncle, the phantom relative who had bequeathed him this metal tomb. The writing was neat, controlled, "My name is Arthur Vance." The first line read, "If you are reading this, it means I have failed, or I am dead. I cannot bear the weight of this secret any longer, but I am too much of a coward to face the consequences, so I will bury the truth here, with the proof of the crime. Let God forgive me for what I have done, and for what I have failed to do." Leo's blood ran cold. Crime. Proof. Coward. The words leapt off the page, charged with a decades-old fear. He had not stumbled upon a simple treasure. He had unearthed a confession. He had opened a time capsule containing a story of guilt and terror. He quickly scanned a few more pages, his eyes jumping from line to line, trying to piece together the narrative. The journal spoke of a powerful man, a landowner. It spoke of secret trips in the dead of night, of human cargo loaded into the back of his trailer. It spoke of fear, duress, and of being an unwilling accomplice to something monstrous. The jewelry, he was beginning to understand, wasn't the loot from a heist. It was a collection of mementos, personal effects, the last physical traces of people who had disappeared. The thought made him feel sick to his stomach. The beautiful, glittering objects in the satchel suddenly seemed tainted, grotesque. They were not symbols of fortune, they were artifacts of tragedy. A terrible, crushing weight settled on Leo's shoulders, the weight of knowledge. He was no longer just a desperate father trying to survive. He was now the keeper of a terrible secret, a secret someone had killed to protect. He closed the journal, the soft slap of the cover echoing in the cab. He looked at the satchel, then at his daughter, her innocent face illuminated by the phone's glow. This discovery didn't solve his problems. It had multiplied them 1,000-fold. The money, the jewels, it was blood money. And taking it, using it, would make him part of the story. But ignoring it, leaving it here, meant returning to a state of absolute desperation. He was trapped. The fear he felt now was a different beast from the fear of poverty. The fear of hunger and cold was a primal, simple thing. This new fear was complex and insidious. It was the fear of men who commit terrible crimes and bury the evidence. It was the fear of a secret so dark that his great-uncle chose to hide it in a welded steel box and then drink himself to an early grave, as a later entry suggested. This wasn't a lottery ticket, it was a landmine. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the side of the truck, making the whole massive structure groan. The loose plastic over the window ripped completely free and went sailing into the darkness, leaving a gaping hole. An icy blast of air flooded the cab, extinguishing the fragile warmth their bodies had generated. The cold was shocking, brutal. It was as if the world outside was trying to claw its way in, to reclaim the secret he had just uncovered. The wind howled through the broken window, no longer a mournful song, but a shrieking, furious warning. It sounded like a voice, trying to tell him to close the box, put the floor back, and run, and never look back. He looked at the open compartment, a dark mouth in the floor of the truck. He had opened Pandora's box, and now the evils of a past he never knew were swirling around him in the dark, cold night. He carefully placed the journal back into the satchel, on top of the cold, silent jewels. He closed the heavy leather flap, the brass clasps clicking shut with a sound of grim finality. For a wild moment, he considered putting it all back. He could shove the satchel into its metal tomb, slam the hatch shut, replace the vinyl flooring, and pretend none of this ever happened. They could take their chances in the cold, try to walk to the nearest town in the morning. It was a tempting thought to simply refuse the burden, to choose ignorance and poverty over this dangerous knowledge. But as he looked at Mia, her small body racked by another coughing fit, her face pale and feverish in the gloom, he knew it was an illusion. There was no choice. He couldn't let her get sicker. He couldn't let her starve. This treasure, this curse, was their only way out. He had to understand what it meant. He had to know who his great-uncle was so afraid of. He had to protect it. That was his first clear thought through the fog of shock and fear. If this secret was dangerous, then the satchel was a target. He couldn't just leave it sitting out. He hefted the heavy bag. Where could he hide it? Putting it back in the compartment felt wrong, too obvious. If someone else knew about this truck, that would be the first place they looked. He scanned the filthy cab. There were no good options. He decided, for now, The safest place was with him. He rummaged through their meager belongings and found the larger, mostly empty duffel bag they had used to carry their blankets. He carefully placed the heavy leather satchel inside, then piled their dirty clothes and the spare blanket on top of it. It wasn't a perfect disguise, but it would have to do. The added weight was significant, a constant, physical reminder of the secret he now carried. With the treasure hidden, a fragile sense of control returned. The immediate crisis of the cold, however, was now more pressing than ever. With the window plastic gone, the cab was like a wind tunnel. He knew they couldn't stay here, but where could they go? He took out the journal again. He needed to understand the danger. He needed a name. He huddled with Mia under the one remaining blanket, using his body to shield her from the worst of the draft. He aimed the phone's dying light at the first few pages of the journal and began to read. Arthur Vance's story, written in a cramped, fearful hand, started to unspool in the darkness. He wrote of his arrival in Havenwood County, a young man looking for work. He wrote of his new job, driving for the most powerful man in the region, a man who owned the quarries, the timber mills, and the soul of every politician, a man who was respected, feared, and admired. Leo's eyes scanned the page, his finger tracing the faded ink, and then he saw it. The name of Arthur's boss, the man who had forced him into the heart of the darkness. Mr. Finch, Arthur had written. He has the smile of a saint and the eyes of a shark. He offered me a bonus for a special trips. Cash in hand, no questions asked. I was young and foolish and desperate. I said yes. God help me. I said yes. The name hung in the air, charged with menace. Finch. It was a simple, unassuming name, but in the context of the journal, it felt like a curse. Leo felt his blood run cold. This was the man his great-uncle was terrified of, a man of power and influence, a man who made people disappear, and according to the journal, a man who was still very much alive, at least when the last entry was written. The mystery was no longer an abstract puzzle. It now had a face and a name. He sat there in the freezing darkness of the cab, the dead weight of the hidden satchel beside him, the name, Finch, echoing in his mind. The world had fundamentally shifted in the last hour. He was no longer Leo, the broken, homeless mechanic. He was now Leo, the man who had found Arthur Vance's secret. He was the sole inheritor of a fortune in blood money and a journal that could bring down a powerful man. He looked out the broken window at the vast, starless black of the countryside. The isolation that had felt so oppressive and hopeless before now felt like something else entirely. Exposure. They were not just alone. They were visible. A target. The sound of the wind was no longer just wind. Every gust sounded like footsteps. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a whisper. The mystery had been found. And now, Leo had a terrifying feeling that the mystery was about to find him. The first rays of dawn were a cruel mockery, painting the grim interior of the cab in shades of grey and revealing the true extent of the filth. Sleep had been a distant country Leo could not visit. He had spent the night in a state of suspended terror, the weight of the satchel a physical ache in his side, the words from the journal burning behind his eyes. He had read until his phone's battery warning flashed a desperate red. The story was more horrific than he could have imagined. Arthur hadn't been a thief. He had been a witness, a cog in a machine of murder. The journal detailed late-night drives to remote, unmarked locations in the vast wilderness of Havenwood County. He described the people crammed into the back of his sealed trailer, their faces obscured, their pleas muffled. They weren't hardened criminals. The journal called them students, union organizers, journalists, and farmers who refused to sell their land to the ever-expanding Finch empire. A cold, hard knot of dread formed in Leo's stomach. This wasn't just a crime. It was a cleansing. Arthur's guilt was a living presence on the pages, a palpable force that reached across 40 years. He described the sound of the trailer doors being locked from the outside, the long, silent drives into the deep woods, the gnawing terror of knowing he was transporting people to their deaths. He wrote of the heavy, cloying smell of fear and sweat that would cling to the trailer for days. He was never allowed to see what happened. He would drive to a designated spot, be told to wait, and then hear the sounds of shovels hitting rocky soil, the muffled shouts, And then the terrible, echoing silence that followed. Finch's men would return, their boots muddy, their faces grim and emotionless. They would hand him a bonus, an envelope thick with cash, and warn him to forget what he hadn't seen. But he couldn't forget the sounds. He couldn't forget the smell. Leo felt a wave of nausea. He was sitting in the very same cab where a terrified Arthur Vance had sat, listening to people being murdered. The jewels were the most damning part of the confession. After one of the special trips, Finch's right-hand man had tossed the heavy satchel into the cab with Arthur. "A little bonus," he'd said with a cruel smirk. "Mementos from the ungrateful." When Arthur opened it later, he'd vomited. Inside were the personal effects of the victims he had just transported. A gold wedding band, still warm from a finger. A woman's locket with pictures of 2 small children inside. A man's watch, its crystal cracked. Each piece was a testament to a life extinguished. Arthur realized Finch wasn't just killing them, he was erasing them, stealing the last physical proof of their existence. The jewels weren't a payment, they were a trophy, a sick, glittering monument to his power and brutality. Racked with a guilt that was driving him mad, Arthur couldn't bring himself to sell them or throw them away. They were evidence, proof. He welded the safe into the truck's frame and hid them, along with his terrible story, vowing to one day find the courage to go to the authorities. That day never came. The final entries in the journal were a descent into paranoia and alcoholism. Arthur wrote of being watched, of seeing unfamiliar cars parked down the road from his small home. He believed Finch knew he had kept the jewels. The fear paralyzed him. He quit his job, parked the Kenworth on this worthless patch of land, a place nobody would ever want, and drank. He drank to forget the sounds, the smells, the faces he imagined in the dark. He drank to numb the crushing weight of his cowardice. The last entry was brief, the handwriting a shaky, barely legible scrawl. "He knows. I see his car. God forgive me. I'm so sorry." That was it. The story ended. Leo closed the journal, his hands trembling. Arthur hadn't died of a simple heart attack. He had died of terror. He had been silenced. And now, 40 years later, Leo was sitting in the same truck, on the same land, with the same damning evidence. The silence of the morning felt heavy, watchful. A sound, sharp and out of place, shattered the morning stillness. It wasn't the wind or the rustle of animals. It was the crunch of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate. Leo's head snapped up, his heart instantly hammering against his ribs. He scrambled to the torn-out window of the cab, peering through the skeletal trees. A long black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, was easing its way down the rutted dirt track. It moved with a predator's grace, utterly alien in this landscape of decay. It was a vision of wealth and power, a stark and terrifying contrast to the rust and ruin that surrounded him. Leo felt a primal urge to hide. He instinctively grabbed Mia, who was still sleeping fitfully, and pulled the filthy blanket over her, shushing her before she could even wake. He shoved the duffel bag containing the satchel deeper into the shadows of the cab. His mouth was desert dry, a sour taste of adrenaline on his tongue. They had been found. The car came to a stop a few yards from the truck, its engine humming with a quiet, expensive purr before cutting out. The sudden silence was more menacing than the sound had been. For a long moment, nothing happened. The tinted windows of the sedan were opaque, reflecting the grey sky and the skeletal trees like dark, unblinking eyes. Leo held his breath, his muscles coiled tight. Then, the driver's door opened with a soft, solid click. A man emerged, unfolding himself from the car with a slow, deliberate stiffness that spoke of great age but not fragility. He was tall and thin, dressed in a tailored tweed jacket and dark trousers, his silver hair neatly combed. In one hand, he held a polished wooden cane with a silver handle. He leaned on it slightly as he surveyed the scene, his gaze sweeping over the desolate plot of land, the dead weeds, and finally, coming to rest on the rusting hulk of the Kenworth. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to pin Leo in place. The old man began to walk towards the truck, his expensive leather shoes making soft sounds in the damp earth. He moved with an unnerving confidence, as if he owned the very ground he walked on. As he drew closer, Leo could see his face more clearly. It was a mask of wrinkles and age spots, but the underlying bone structure was sharp and imperious. His lips were set in a thin, neutral line, but his eyes were a piercing, pale blue. They were cold, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a shark. Leo felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it was like a physical blow. The phrase, lifted directly from Arthur's journal, echoed in his mind. It had to be him. This was him. Alistair Finch. A wave of icy terror washed over Leo, so profound it left him breathless. He felt like a mouse staring up at the shadow of a hawk, frozen by the certainty of his own doom. "Good morning." The voice was surprisingly gentle, a raspy but cultured baritone. It was the voice of a respected elder, a community patriarch. It did not match the coldness in his eyes. Finch stopped about 10 feet from the cab, leaning on his cane. His gaze was fixed on Leo, who was now half visible in the cab's grimy doorway. "Quite the fixer-upper you've got here." A faint, dry smile touched his lips. "I was sorry to hear about Arthur Vance. He was a good man, in his way. Worked for me, you know. A long, long time ago." The casual mention of his great-uncle's name made the hairs on Leo's arms stand up. Finch was playing a game, establishing a connection, feigning a shared history. Leo could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. He felt Mia stir behind him and placed a heavy, warning hand on her shoulder. He had to protect her. He had to get this man away from her. Finch's pale eyes drifted from Leo and scanned the truck, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the passenger-side cab. It was a fleeting glance, almost imperceptible, but to Leo, whose every nerve was screaming with alarm, it was a search. He was looking. He was checking. The realization hit Leo like a physical punch. Finch knew. He knew about the compartment. He didn't know if anything was still in it, but he knew it existed. A local gossip travels fast in a small county like this, Finch continued, his tone conversational, friendly. "Word got to me that Arthur's heir had arrived. A man and his little girl, they said. I own most of the surrounding land, you see. I like to know my neighbors." The word neighbors hung in the air, weighted with unspoken meaning. It was not a welcome. It was an assertion of dominance. "I am the king here. You are on my land." The old man gestured vaguely at the rusting truck with his cane. "Truth be told, this thing is an eyesore. And a liability. Been meaning to have it hauled away for scrap for years, but sentimental reasons, I suppose. A memory of an old employee." His gaze snapped back to Leo, suddenly sharp, pinning him. "But you're his family. You have the proper claim. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you $500, cash, for the whole lot. The truck, the trailer, everything. More than fair for a pile of scrap metal. Enough to get you and your little girl a bus ticket to somewhere warmer, I imagine." The offer was a slap in the face. $500. It was an insult. A test. It was just enough money to seem like a plausible offer for scrap, but paltry enough that only a man who knew nothing of the truck's true secret would even consider it. Leo's mind raced. To accept was to walk away. To leave the secret buried. To refuse. What would refusing signal? Leo found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse croak. I need to think about it." He tried to sound casual, non-committal, but he could hear the tremor of fear in his own words. He felt naked, exposed, his desperate thoughts almost certainly visible on his face. Finch's faint smile never wavered, but the cold light in his eyes intensified. He took a slow step closer, invading Leo's space. His cologne, a scent of old leather and cedar, overwhelming the smell of rust and decay. "Think about it." Finch's voice dropped, losing its grandfatherly warmth and taking on a hard, menacing edge. "There's nothing to think about, son. This is a generous offer, the only one you're likely to get." He tapped the rusted fender of the truck with the silver head of his cane. The thump of the impact sounded unnervingly like the hollow spot on the floor. Leo flinched. "It's a dangerous place out here for a man on his own," Finch said, his voice now a low, confidential murmur. He leaned in closer, his gaze dropping to the blanket where Mia was hidden. "Especially a man with a child." The words were like ice down Leo's spine. Finch knew about Mia. He had seen her. He was using her. This is wild country. Unpredictable. He looked around at the skeletal trees, the overgrown brush, as if seeing dangers invisible to Leo. Lots of rattlesnakes this time of year. Nasty business. A snake bite. And the weather. It can turn on you in an instant. People get lost out here. Get hurt. His eyes locked with Leo's, and the pretense of casual conversation fell away completely, revealing the cold, reptilian predator beneath. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Finch straightened up, the mask of the friendly patriarch settling back over his features, but it was too late. Leo had seen the monster. Accidents happen, Finch said, the words simple, declarative, and utterly terrifying. It would be a terrible shame if something were to happen to you or your little girl. A terrible shame. He let the words hang in the cold morning air for a moment, a poison that would linger long after he was gone. He gave Leo one last, long look, a look of appraisal, of warning, of finality. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, his cane making crisp, rhythmic taps on the damp earth. The sound was like a clock, ticking down. Leo stood frozen, his heart a block of ice in his chest, and watched as the black sedan started its engine, turned around, and disappeared back down the dirt track, leaving him alone once more in the suffocating silence. He stumbled back into the cab, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. He collapsed onto the filthy floor, pulling Mia into his arms. She was awake now, her eyes wide with fear. Who was that, Daddy? That scary old man? Leo couldn't answer. He could only hold her tight, the rough texture of the blanket scratching his cheek. The $500 wasn't an offer. It was an ultimatum. Finch hadn't come to buy a truck. He had come to see who had inherited Arthur Vance's secret. He had come to measure his new opponent. And now he knew Leo had a daughter. He knew Leo was desperate, and Leo's hesitation had told him the one thing he needed to confirm, that Leo had found something. The game had begun. The threat was no longer a 40-year-old ghost story in a journal. It was here, now, in the form of a powerful, ruthless old man who had just promised to destroy him. Leo was trapped. The satchel full of jewels and diamonds felt less like a treasure now and more like a time bomb strapped to his chest. Finch's threat echoed in his mind. Accidents happen. It wasn't a question of if he would come back. It was a question of when and what he would do. The truth in that journal could send him to prison for the rest of his life, and he had just looked into the eyes of a man who would do anything to keep that from happening. Leo looked down at his daughter's trusting face, then at the duffel bag containing the proof of Finch's crimes. He was caught between an impossible past and a terrifying future. What would you do in his position? Would you take the satchel and run for your life, hoping to disappear before Finch's men find you? Or would you stand your ground and fight for the ghosts in that journal, risking not only your own life, but the life of your child, for a justice 40 years overdue? The silence Finch left behind was louder and more terrifying than any sound. It was a vacuum, filled with the echo of his final words. Accidents happen. Leo felt the phrase imprint itself on his soul, a brand of pure terror. He was no longer just stranded. He was marked. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, and he could feel a tremor starting in his hands, a physical manifestation of the dread that was now consuming him. He looked around at the decaying truck, the desolate patch of dirt. It wasn't a shelter. It was a cage, a trap Finch had allowed him to walk into. The old man's visit wasn't a negotiation. It was an assessment. He had looked into Leo's eyes and seen not just desperation, but the flicker of knowledge. He had seen the truth, and Leo's failure to immediately accept the insulting offer of $500 had been a confession. He had signed his own death warrant and that of his daughter with a simple, hesitant pause. The wind whistled through the broken window, no longer a mournful sound, but the hiss of an approaching serpent. He had to move. Now, the plan, if it could be called that, formed in a dizzying haze of adrenaline and fear. He couldn't stay. Finch's men could return at any moment. The truck, which hours ago had represented a desperate hope, and then a treasure chest, was now nothing more than a giant metal tombstone waiting for his name to be carved on it. He remembered from the night before a faint, solitary pinpoint of light he had seen shimmering miles away in the inky blackness. At the time it had seemed impossibly distant, another star in a cold sky. Now it was his only bearing, his only conceivable direction. It was a gamble as desperate as the bus ride to get here, but it was a move, and movement was the opposite of waiting to die. He began to gather their pathetic belongings with frantic, clumsy hands. The duffel bag, now impossibly heavy with the weight of the satchel, felt like an anchor. He hoisted it onto his shoulder, the strap digging painfully into his flesh, a constant, physical reminder of the cursed treasure that was now the source of all his hope and all his peril. Mia was awake, her small face a mask of confusion and fear. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the terror radiating from her father in palpable waves. "Daddy, what's wrong? Are we leaving our truck house?" Her voice was small and fragile, and the question pierced Leo's heart with a fresh spike of guilt. "Yes, sweetie. We're going on another walk. A little adventure." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He bundled her in the thin blanket, the fabric still smelling of mildew and despair. He took one last look at the cab, the scene of his impossible discovery, the grime and the rot that had, for a few hours, held the promise of salvation. Now it just looked squalid and menacing. He stepped out of the truck and onto the damp earth, not daring to look back. He hoisted Mia into his arms, her feverish body a warm, precious weight against his chest. He positioned the heavy duffel bag on his other shoulder and began to walk, turning his back on the rusting Kenworth and heading toward a desperate, shimmering point of light he could only pray was not another mirage. The journey was a descent into a new kind of hell. The dirt track gave way to a cracked and crumbling asphalt road that ran parallel to the main highway. Walking on the shoulder, Leo felt exposed, a silhouette against the fading light of dusk. The wind was a constant, physical assault, whipping at their clothes and carrying a deep, bone-aching chill. Every car that passed on the distant highway sent a fresh jolt of panic through him. Was it them? Was it one of Finch's men, casually patrolling, looking for the foolish man and his child who had dared to refuse their master? The weight of Mia and the duffel bag was immense, a crushing burden that settled deep in his bones. His shoulders screamed in protest, and his legs, already weak from hunger and exhaustion, felt like lead. He shifted Mia's weight, her head resting on his shoulder, her soft, shallow breaths a constant, terrifying reminder of what was at stake. He could feel her shivering, even through the blanket. The cold was getting to her, and his desperate flight was only making it worse. He trudged on, his world shrinking to the next step, and the one after that. The landscape was monotonous and bleak, a panorama of dying fields and skeletal trees under a bruised purple sky. The sounds of the wilderness, which might have once seemed peaceful, were now menacing. The rustle of leaves in the brush was a footstep. The cry of a distant bird was a signal. His mind, frayed and paranoid, turned every shadow into a lurking figure. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for the light. For a while, he thought he'd imagined it, that his desperate mind had created a false beacon. But then, as he crested a small rise in the road, he saw it again. It was closer now, clearer. Not a star. It was a neon sign, a splash of hazy red and blue against the encroaching darkness. It was a structure, a building, a sign of life. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over him, but it was immediately followed by a cold tide of suspicion. This was Havenwood County, Finch's County. Was any light here truly safe? He pushed the suspicion down. He had no other choice. The diner, for that's what it had to be, was a chance for warmth, for food, for a moment's respite from the relentless wind. He left the road and cut across a field of damp, dead grass, the diner's sign growing larger and more detailed with every agonizing step. He could make out a word now, written in buzzing, cursive neon, Beatrice's. Below it, a steaming coffee cup blinked on and off, a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse of blue light. The building itself was small and isolated, a low-slung structure with large windows that glowed with a warm, yellow light. It looked like a relic from another era, a lonely outpost on a forgotten highway. As he got closer, a new smell cut through the cold air, overwhelming the scent of damp earth and decay. It was the smell of hot coffee, of frying bacon, of life. His stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. He hesitated at the edge of the gravel parking lot, a dark figure clutching a child and a heavy bag, a ghost on the edge of a warm, living world. The sound of a bell jingling as the door opened was like a gunshot in the silence of his flight. A man in a trucker hat walked out, nodding to Leo before getting into a pickup truck and driving away. The brief, casual interaction was enough to break Leo's paralysis. He took a deep breath, shifted Mia's weight, and walked to the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. Pushing it open, he was hit by a wall of warmth that was almost a physical blow. It was a profound, enveloping heat that seemed to melt the ice that had formed around his heart. The air was thick with the smells of sizzling fat, brewed coffee, and old, comfortable vinyl. A country song played softly from a radio behind the counter. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone figure sitting in a booth in the corner. Behind the long Formica counter, a woman was wiping down a coffee machine. She looked up as the bell jingled, her expression weary, but her eyes sharp and intelligent. They took in Leo's ragged appearance, the child in his arms, the desperation etched onto his face. She was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a simple, faded apron over a plaid shirt. Her hands, though gnarled with age, moved with a steady, practiced efficiency. She was Beatrice. Leo felt his defenses rise, his body tense for the inevitable rejection, the command to leave, but it didn't come. Her gaze softened as she looked at Mia, whose weak cough echoed in the quiet diner. "Well, don't just stand there letting the cold in," she said, her voice raspy but not unkind. "Get the child into a booth before she freezes solid. You both look like you've been wrestling with ghosts." The unexpected kindness was disarming. Leo, unsure how to respond, simply nodded and slid into a cracked red vinyl booth, gently settling Mia onto the seat beside him. The warmth of the diner was already beginning to seep into their bones, a blessed relief that was so profound it felt like a dream. He watched as Beatrice poured a cup of coffee and brought it over, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving him. "She needs something hot in her belly," Beatrice stated, not asking. "Soup's on, split pea, it'll stick to your ribs." Before Leo could even think about how he would pay, she had turned and ladled 2 steaming bowls, placing them on the table along with a basket of crackers. The smell was intoxicating, rich and savory. He looked at the food, then at the old woman, a question in his eyes. "Don't you worry about that now," she said, seeming to read his mind. "You eat. Get some warmth in that little one." Mia, roused by the smell, sat up and began to eat with a ravenous hunger that pained Leo to see. He watched her for a moment before taking a spoonful of his own soup. The hot, thick liquid was an explosion of flavor and warmth, a resurrection. It was the first real food, the first real kindness he had experienced in what felt like a lifetime. He ate slowly, savoring every spoonful, feeling strength and clarity slowly returning to his exhausted mind and body. This woman, this stranger, had just offered him a lifeline without asking a single question. As Mia finished her soup, her shivering subsided, and her head began to nod with exhaustion. Soon, she was fast asleep, curled up on the vinyl seat, her face finally peaceful. The diner was completely empty now, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the soft crackle of the radio. Beatrice was at the end of the counter, polishing glasses, but Leo could feel her watching him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this was his only chance. He couldn't run forever. He needed help. He needed an ally. Taking a shaky breath, he slid the heavy duffel bag onto the seat, his hands fumbling inside. He felt the cold, hard cover of the journal. He hesitated. Showing this to her would be crossing a line. It would endanger her. It would make his story, his problem, her reality. But the memory of Finch's cold eyes, the casual menace in his voice, pushed him forward. He pulled the small, dark book from the bag and walked to the counter, placing it on the clean Formica surface between them. It lay there, a block of pure darkness in the warm light of the diner. Beatrice stopped polishing the glass, her eyes fixed on the journal. She looked from the book to Leo's face, her expression unreadable. "What's this?" she asked, her voice low. "I think I'm in trouble," Leo said, his own voice barely a whisper. "I inherited a piece of land from my great-uncle, Arthur Vance. This was with his things." At the mention of the name, Beatrice froze. Her hand, holding the polishing cloth, went still. A flicker of something, recognition, pain, a memory long buried, passed across her face. She slowly put the glass down and wiped her hands on her apron, a methodical, stalling gesture. She reached out with a trembling finger and touched the cover of the journal, as if it were a venomous snake. Then, with a deep, resigned sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades, she picked it up. She didn't open it immediately. She just held it, her knuckles white. She looked at Leo, her sharp eyes searching his, and then down at the sleeping form of his daughter in the booth. Whatever she saw seemed to make up her mind. She opened the book to the first page. The silence in the diner stretched, becoming heavy and thick. The only sound was the soft whisper of a page turning, then another. Leo watched Beatrice's face, a canvas upon which a 40-year-old tragedy was being repainted. He saw her initial curiosity shift to confusion, then to a dawning horror. Her breath hitched. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes, which had been simply tired, were now wide with a fresh and terrible grief. She stopped on a page, her finger tracing a line of faded blue ink. He couldn't see the page, but he could see the name reflected in her eyes, hear it in the choked, broken sound that escaped her lips. "Daniel," she whispered, the name a ghost on her breath. She looked up at Leo, her face pale, tears welling and tracing new paths through the old wrinkles on her cheeks. "Daniel," she said again, her voice stronger now, laced with a pain so raw it was shocking. "That was my brother's name, my little brother." The final piece of the puzzle, the one Leo didn't even know was missing, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The story poured out of her then, a torrent of grief and suspicion that had been dammed up for 4 decades. Daniel had been a student at the State University, an idealist, full of fire and fury. He had come home that summer to organize the local farmers, the small landowners who were being systematically squeezed and threatened by Alistair Finch's expanding empire. Finch wanted their land for his quarries, and he was not taking no for an answer. "Danny was fearless," Beatrice said, her voice thick with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "He told them not to be afraid, that they had rights, that Finch couldn't just steal their livelihoods. He held meetings. He wrote letters to the newspaper. He was making noise." She paused, dabbing her eyes with a corner of her apron. "Then one night, he just disappeared. He went to a meeting at a farm on the west side of the county and never came home. The police said he probably ran off. They said he was a troublemaker." Her voice broke. "But I knew. We all knew. It was Finch. It had to be." Her testimony was a horrifying echo of the journal's confessions. The student activist mentioned in Arthur's terrified scrawl wasn't just a faceless victim. He was the brother of the kind woman who had just given his daughter a bowl of soup. Leo felt a profound, sickening wave of vertigo. The past was not the past. It was sitting right here, at this counter, weeping for a brother who had been erased by a powerful man. The jewels, the money, the secret in the truck. It was all tied to this woman's personal tragedy. Leo was no longer just a man who had stumbled upon a treasure. He was the bearer of a truth that this woman had waited a lifetime to hear. "They took his car," Beatrice continued, her voice a low, angry murmur. "They found it a week later, abandoned by the river, but Danny, he was gone. His wallet was in the car, his favorite jacket, and this." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. "He bought this for me. He was supposed to give it to me for my birthday, the week after he vanished. His roommate found it in his drawer and sent it to me. It was all I had left of him." The journal lay open on the counter between them, a bridge across 40 years of silence and fear. Beatrice's story had given the ghosts a name and a face. It had transformed the abstract horror of Arthur's confession into a concrete, personal agony. Leo now felt a burning, righteous anger coiling in his gut, eclipsing his fear. This wasn't just about his own survival anymore. It was about Daniel. It was about the other names in that book, the other lives stolen by Finch and his thugs. The satchel of jewels wasn't blood money to be spent. It was evidence to be used. It was the only voice the dead had left. He looked at Beatrice, whose tears of grief were now hardening into a steely resolve. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an unspoken alliance was forged. They were no longer a desperate man and a grieving sister. They were partners, bound together by a terrible secret and the shared knowledge of Alistair Finch's monstrous crimes. They were the only two people in the world who could prove what he had done. "You were right to be afraid," Beatrice said, her voice low and firm, the grief replaced by a grim pragmatism. "Finch is not a man who leaves loose ends. He has owned this county, the judges, the sheriff, for 50 years. When his men make a problem go away, it stays away." Her eyes darted toward the large front window of the diner, which looked out onto the dark, empty highway. A sudden unease flickered across her face. "He knows you have it," she whispered, her gaze locking with Leo's. "His visit this morning, that wasn't a test. It was a confirmation. He saw it in your eyes. He knows you didn't just find an empty truck." Her words sent a fresh chill down Leo's spine, colder than the wind outside. He had thought his hesitation was a mistake. She was telling him there had been no right move. From the moment he found that journal, his fate had been sealed in Finch's mind. He was a problem that needed to go away. The quiet hum of the diner's refrigerator suddenly sounded deafening, a countdown to an unknown horror. Just then, the stillness of the night was shattered. The headlights of a vehicle, moving fast, swept across the diner's front windows, momentarily blinding them. Beatrice flinched, instinctively moving away from the light. The vehicle didn't slow. It was a low-slung pickup truck, its engine a low, powerful rumble, and it sped past the diner, heading back in the direction from which Leo had just come, back towards the Kenworth. Beatrice stared after it, her face ashen in the dim light. "I know that truck," she said, her voice a strained, terrified whisper. "That's Bill Sykes' truck. He and his brother have been Finch's dirty hands for as long as I can remember. If there's a problem, they are who he sends to fix it." The implication was immediate and horrifying. They weren't coming for Leo first. They were going for the evidence. They were going to the one place they believed the proof still was. They were going to sanitize the crime scene. They were going to destroy the truck. "He's not going to risk you going to the authorities," Beatrice said, her mind working fast, her fear sharpening her thoughts. "He'll destroy the truck, destroy the compartment, melt it all down to nothing, erase the last piece of the puzzle. And once that's gone," she didn't have to finish the sentence. "Once the primary evidence was destroyed, all that was left was the journal, the jewels, and the witness. Leo. A loose end that would be much easier to deal with. He was a transient, a nobody. If he and his daughter disappeared in the vast, empty wilderness of Havenwood County, who would even look for them? Who would question the official story of a tragic accident, of a desperate father who got lost in the woods? The genius of Finch's evil was its simplicity, its brutal efficiency. He was erasing the past, step by step, and Leo was the final step. The weight of the satchel in the duffel bag suddenly felt 100 times heavier. It was all that was left. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Leo. His first instinct was to run, to grab Mia and the bag and just burst out the door into the night. But where would he go? The road was a death trap. Finch's men were out there. He was cornered. Beatrice grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to me," she commanded, her voice fierce. "You can't use the road. They'll be watching it. There's a path through the woods behind the diner. It's overgrown, but it leads up into the hills. You have to go now. Take the path and don't stop until you reach the old logging trail. Hide, wait until dawn." Her words were a lifeline, a desperate, last-minute plan. She was thinking, fighting, while he was frozen in terror. She was risking everything for him, for the memory of her brother. Her diner was the only thing she had, and she was turning it into a shield for a man she had met only an hour ago. The depth of her courage shamed his own fear into submission. He had to move. He acted on pure, adrenaline-fueled instinct. He raced back to the booth, his movements swift and silent. Mia was still fast asleep, oblivious to the terror that had just erupted around them. He scooped her up in one arm, her small body warm and limp. She mumbled something in her sleep but didn't wake. With his other hand, he grabbed the duffel bag, swinging the immense weight of it over his shoulder. The strain on his muscles was excruciating, but he barely felt it. He turned back to Beatrice, who was already at the back door of the diner, holding it open. It led into a dark, cramped storeroom that smelled of bleach and old potatoes. "Go," she urged, her face grim. "Don't look back. I'll tell them you were never here. I'll tell them you left hours ago, heading south. It's all I can do." He wanted to thank her, to say something, but the words were stuck in his throat, choked by a knot of fear and a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He could only nod, a quick, jerky motion, before plunging through the doorway. The back door of the storeroom opened into absolute blackness. The cold night air was a shock to his system after the warmth of the diner. It felt like diving into an icy lake. The wind howled in the trees, a wild, furious sound. Beatrice pointed into the impenetrable darkness behind the diner. "There. Just keep the sound of the highway to your left." "Now go!" He didn't hesitate. He burst out of the doorway and into the night, his feet sinking into soft, damp earth. He ran, blindly, charging into the tree line. Branches whipped at his face, scratching his skin. Thorns tore at his clothes. He stumbled over unseen roots, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic, wild rhythm that matched his pounding feet. He held Mia tight against his chest, shielding her with his body. The heavy bag swayed and slammed against his back, threatening to throw him off balance with every step. He was running on pure terror. The image of Bill Sykes' truck burned into his mind. He fought his way deeper into the woods, the darkness a thick, suffocating blanket. The sounds of the highway faded, replaced by the pounding of his own blood in his ears and the rasp of his own ragged breathing. He could taste blood and dirt in his mouth. After what felt like an eternity, he risked a glance back. He had put some distance between himself and the diner, which was now just a small, warm rectangle of light in the distance. He stopped for a second, his lungs burning, leaning against the rough bark of a large pine tree to catch his breath. He looked in the other direction, towards where the Kenworth sat, several miles away. The sky in that direction was black, dotted with a few cold, distant stars. And then it happened. A sudden, silent bloom of orange light blossomed over the treetops. It grew with terrifying speed, a malevolent sunrise in the middle of the night, painting the underside of the clouds a sickening, fiery red. A moment later, a faint, deep whoosh rolled through the forest, a sound that he felt in the soles of his feet and the base of his spine. It was the sound of 40 gallons of gasoline igniting, of a 40-year-old secret being turned into a raging inferno. The truck was gone. The metal tomb, the treasure chest, the only solid link to Arthur Vance's confession, was being consumed by fire. Finch's men were erasing the scene, destroying the last vestiges of a crime, turning the truth into ash and smoke. A cold, horrifying thought struck him. If Beatrice hadn't seen them, if he had stayed at the truck for even another 30 minutes, he and Mia would be in that fire. They would be part of the ashes, another one of Finch's problems that had simply, tragically, disappeared. The orange glow of the distant fire cast long, dancing shadows through the woods, making the trees look like skeletal figures reaching for him. He turned his back on the blaze, hugged his daughter tighter, and ran deeper into the suffocating darkness, the light of his burning past chasing him. He ran until his lungs were ragged, burning torches in his chest. The forest was a labyrinth of grasping branches and treacherous roots, the orange glow of the distant fire a terrifying beacon at his back. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a leaf, was the sound of Finch's men closing in. He held Mia tight, her small, warm body a fragile anchor in a world that had spun into chaos. He could feel the dead weight of the duffel bag, a constant, punishing reminder of the treasure that had become a curse. The woods finally thinned, and he saw it again, the faint, warm glow of Beatrice's diner. It was the only sanctuary in a county that wanted him dead. He stumbled out of the tree line and across the gravel lot, collapsing against the back door of the storeroom. It opened instantly. Beatrice pulled them inside, her face a grim mask of resolve. She didn't speak, simply bolted the door behind them, plunging them into the familiar, safe smell of bleach and coffee, a tiny island in an ocean of terror. Beatrice hid them in the cramped, cold pantry, behind sacks of potatoes and flour. The space was tight, the darkness absolute. Leo could hear Mia's soft, sleeping breaths and the frantic, wild drumming of his own heart. From the main diner, he heard the faint, distinct beeping of a telephone keypad. Beatrice's voice was a low, urgent murmur, a thread of sound weaving through the darkness. "John, it's Beatrice. From Havenwood." "Yes, it's been a long time. Listen, you always told me if I ever found real proof about what happened to my brother, I should call you, no matter the time. John, I have it. I have it all." There was a long pause, filled only by the hum of the diner's refrigerator. Leo held his breath. He was staking his life and his daughter's on a 40-year-old promise made to a grieving sister. Then he heard Beatrice's voice again, firm and clear. "An hour. We'll be here. Be careful. He owns the night in this county." The line clicked dead. Hope, sharp and terrifyingly real, pierced through Leo's despair. The hour was the longest of Leo's life. He sat in the dark pantry, the cold seeping into his bones, the heavy satchel resting at his feet like a sleeping beast. Every passing set of headlights on the highway was a jolt of pure panic. But then, a different sound. Not the rumble of a pickup, but the quiet, confident hum of several sedans pulling into the gravel lot. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just a quiet, professional arrival that was more intimidating than any overt display of force. Beatrice unbolted the pantry door. "They're here," she whispered. Leo emerged, blinking in the warm light of the empty diner. 3 figures in dark suits stood by the counter, their faces serious and calm. An older man with graying temples and sharp, intelligent eyes stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said to Beatrice, his voice respectful, "I'm Special Agent Davies, State Bureau of Investigation. You said you have evidence?" Leo, haggard and trembling, stepped forward and placed the heavy satchel on the counter. With shaking hands, he unclasped it. The investigator's professional composure cracked for just a second as Leo opened the satchel. The hoard of antique jewels and uncut diamonds spilled onto the Formica counter, a river of impossible, glittering wealth under the harsh fluorescent lights. The agent stared, stunned into silence. But it was the small, dark journal that Davies reached for. Leo watched as the agent carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages, his expression hardening with every line he read. He read Arthur Vance's confession, his account of the secret trips, the muffled pleas, the smell of fear. He cross-referenced names and dates with a list Beatrice provided from memory. It was all there, the journal, the jewels, and Beatrice's first-hand testimony about her brother Daniel. The pieces of a 40-year-old crime spree clicked into place with grim, irrefutable certainty. "We have enough," Davies said, his voice cold as steel. "We have more than enough." He looked at Leo, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You've been through hell, son. But it's over now." Dawn was breaking as a convoy of state vehicles descended on Alistair Finch's sprawling estate. The raid was silent and swift. There was no chase, no standoff. Just the sound of tactical boots on a manicured lawn and a firm, authoritative knock on a heavy oak door. Finch, dressed in a silk robe, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief, was taken into custody without a struggle. The man who had ruled Havenwood County with an iron fist for 50 years, the man who made problems and people disappear, was reduced to a stooped old figure in handcuffs, his empire of fear crumbling around him in the soft morning light. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the community, unearthing decades of buried fear and whispered stories. His power, which had seemed absolute and eternal, had been dismantled overnight by a desperate father and a grieving sister who had refused to stay silent. The reign of the shark was finally over. The aftermath was a media storm. The story of the Havenwood butcher and the truck of treasures was national news. But the real validation came from the victims' families. The Bureau released photos of the jewelry, and slowly, calls began to come in. An old woman in Florida wept on a live news broadcast. recognizing the distinctive wedding band that had belonged to her father, a union organizer who had vanished in 1979. A man in California identified a cracked watch as the one his grandfather, a journalist who had written articles critical of Finch, was wearing the day he disappeared. Each identification was another nail in Finch's coffin, another ghost given a name and a story. For Beatrice, the greatest victory was seeing her brother's name cleared. He wasn't a runaway. He was a hero who had died fighting a monster. The tarnished silver locket in her pocket no longer felt like a symbol of loss, but of justice, finally served. Weeks later, Leo sat in a sterile law office in the state capitol, the scent of paper and expensive leather replacing the smell of rust and mildew. A prosecutor from the Attorney General's office explained the legalities. While the jewels were tied to heinous crimes, they had been legally passed to Leo through Arthur Vance's will. Given his indispensable role in bringing a historic criminal to justice and closing dozens of cold cases, the state had made a decision. After setting aside a portion for a victim's restitution fund and identifying heirlooms, the remaining appraised value of the unclaimed assets was his. The lawyer slid a cashier's check across the polished mahogany desk. Leo looked at the number written on the paper, and his mind went blank. The string of zeros seemed to stretch on for an eternity. It was a figure so vast, so life-altering, it felt like a hallucination. He thought of the 4785 he had counted on his knee, the sum total of his failure. This check wasn't just money, it was a new universe. 1 year later, the sound is not a wet, rattling cough, but the bright, clear laughter of a child running through a sun-drenched backyard. The smell is not of cold beans from a can, but of freshly cut grass and burgers sizzling on a grill. Leo stands on the deck of a comfortable 2-story house, a home he owns, watching Mia play on a swing set. She is healthy, vibrant, her cheeks rosy. The shadows that had haunted her eyes are gone, replaced by the simple, unburdened joy of a child who feels safe. He thinks back to the metal coffin in the middle of nowhere, the desperation so profound it had felt like drowning. He had promised her a castle on wheels, a lie born of despair. He had failed to give her that, but he had, through a journey into the heart of darkness, given her something far better, a real home, a future, and the unshakable security of a father who had faced down monsters for her. His hands, gripping the deck railing, are no longer grimy and trembling with fear, but steady and clean. Later that evening, after tucking Mia into a warm bed in a room filled with books and stuffed animals, Leo walks into his garage. It's not a place of labor, but of love. The air smells of wax and clean oil. In the center of the clean, well-lit space sits a half-restored 1969 Ford Mustang, its classic lines gleaming under the overhead lights. He picks up a wrench, the cold, solid weight of the tool familiar and comforting in his hand. He is a mechanic again, a man who fixes things, but he is no longer fixing other people's problems to scrape by. He is restoring something beautiful for himself, for the joy of it. He works late into the night, the quiet, methodical process, a form of meditation. The screaming ghosts of the past have been silenced, replaced by the soft rock music playing from a small radio on his workbench. He is no longer Leo the failure or Leo the fugitive. He is just Leo, a father, a man at peace, finally home. The journey of a life can turn on the most unexpected hinge. For Leo, a rusted-out semi-truck, the very symbol of his rock bottom, held a secret that would lead him through terror and into a new dawn. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the things we see as endings are merely doorways to chapters we have yet to write. And that courage is not the absence of fear, but the act of taking the next step into the dark woods, even when you're terrified. What hidden truths and unexpected treasures lie waiting in the abandoned corners of our own lives, waiting for a desperate hand to uncover them? If you were captivated by this story of resilience against all odds and believe that hope can be found in the most desperate of places, subscribe to our channel for more tales of struggle, mystery, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find redemption.